Hi everyone, this podcast was originally recorded for the module Impactful Entrepreneurship, which is part of the With Proficiency in Entrepreneurship pathway within the business school. I hope you enjoy it. I'm Adam Lusby and I'm your host today as we explore creativity and curiosity. Hi everyone, welcome to this podcast. Today I'm joined by Sarah Campbell, who is Associate Director of Arts and Culture at the University of Exeter. Sarah, welcome to this podcast. Great to have you here. So I guess where the reason I wanted to speak to you was this idea that firstly, I suppose the word creativity, and it's such a big word, particularly when you take in like the idea of arts and culture. And from the business school's perspective, I suppose we look at creativity so probably with a narrower lens. We definitely have ideas of value in there, and innovation comes in, and obviously entrepreneurship. So maybe we start there about that sort of your idea of creativity, what your role entails around creativity. But I suppose first you should probably introduce yourself to the listeners and
Sure.
say a little bit about your role and what you do.
Yeah. Well, I think my background gives the context for why I think of creativity in a particular way. So you're getting a double dose of Kiwis today. I'm also from New Zealand originally, and studied art history in New Zealand. And I ended up finding work in gallery education. And I didn't know that job existed when I was a student, and it changed my life. So over 17 years, I moved around the UK and I worked with big national galleries and regional galleries and university galleries. And my job was always making connections between the artworks, whether it was a temporary exhibition or a permanent collection, and the audiences that came through the door. So you really need to think about the age group, what their interests are, what their motivations are, and then try to sort of modify the sort of connections. So some of it's spoken, some of it's resources, some of it's training. So when I joined Exeter at the beginning of 2019, my role was to, the arts and culture strategy has been developed for the university and launched at the end of 2018. And I needed to sort of pick it up and work with it, turn it into a thing and really develop it. And it was a gift because the mission is activating creativity. That's felt to be absolutely fundamental to what we're here to do. See, what is creativity? Now, often when people think about terms like arts and culture and creativity, there is a lot of people shrink from the word. The response is, I don't know how to draw. I was never very good at art in school, or even worse, my art teacher told me I was bad at art in school and I haven't tried since. So people get somehow in their bones, usually at a young age, that this is not for them or they can't do it. And it then ends up with this interesting split between talent and skill. And you need both. Nobody picks up a guitar and expects to be able to play it perfectly without practice. It takes time. Any other skill, and I think creativity is part of that. You can have a propensity towards it, but it needs to be developed. You can put that time in, and there are processes that you can apply that you can improve your creativity. So what I mean by creativity, there are two parts. One is imaginative thinking, so the ability to come up with ideas, and your relationship with ideas generation is a key part of that. If you are anxious about coming up with bad ideas, that will get in the way. You need to be able to generate a lot of cheap, crappy, terrible ideas and be comfortable with that, and out of that some gold will come to the surface. And then the other side of that is applying that. You can come up with the best idea in the world. You've got to try it. You've got to put it out into the world, see if it sticks, see what works, see what needs improving. And so it's an internal process and an external one. And so to finally go all the way back around to where you started, I think creativity is a process, and it has an application in the business school because you're coming up with new ideas, you're solving problems, you're collaborating, you're communicating, all those key things that artists do I think it's the same formula, it's just sort of applied to a different context. And it's what I love about the role at the university, is that I get to work across every discipline, every college, because where does that not have application, you know?
Yeah, it's brilliant, and I like that. I like that broad view, and also that I suppose it opens up to this multidisciplinary approach, which is definitely becoming more of a. It's more recognised that that's how we're going to solve our complex problems. Is that we're not going to stay in our silos. We're going to break through those silos and collaborate, and that's going to be a key part of, I think, dealing with, well, even dealing with the conditions we've got under the that we've had under the pandemic, but also going forward and dealing with global challenges like climate change. So something that I think is, it's always interested me in that. I always I attach curiosity to my creativity. So there's sort of, it feels like they're this, they're different sides of the same coin. And I really wanted to pick up with you about, how do you see that I suppose these new experiences, or searching for new experiences, is key to the creative world? What part does curiosity play in how we either become more creative or how we apply our creativity, like you were just saying? I'm really interested in that idea of curiosity, because for me, I think one of the biggest dangers or limitations of our current education system is actually we don't reward curiosity as much as we could. We don't train for curiosity, and actually, in many cases, I think our curiosity is dampened by our education rather than growing. So I'm really interested in hear about your experiences in terms of working with, not obviously just in the university, but with artists, with that sort of community, but also your own experience of using curiosity to open those doors, those vital doors that have led to your career.
Curiosity is such a brilliant word, because there is so much in there. And I suppose a useful exercise is, imagine its opposite, a lack of curiosity, where that won't take you anywhere, I suppose. And a way of thinking about curiosity that I found really interesting, I did a big project on creativity about 4 years ago, where I got to go to the US, meet people who were innovating in museum learning, and read a lot about theories around creativity. And the neuroscience is fascinating about how the brain, to be open and receptive and make unexpected connections, you have to be in a certain headspace to sort of encourage that. And there is this thing called latent inhibition, and it's also related to various biases that you can build up. And it enables us to function. It's a really important part of how we work. We have to cut out a lot of information, and we have to categorize and simplify the sensory data that's coming to us, because our brains would get flooded and you couldn't function. If you saw every chair and assumed it was the first chair you'd ever seen, you'd never get anything done. Like, you'd just be totally overwhelmed. But you know what a dog is, you know what a cat is. Before the pandemic, you could roughly expect how your day would go. And there is a lot of information that you cut out. Now, children don't. They haven't been on the planet X number of decades, and they haven't built in all of those assumptions and shortcuts that enable you to move through the day without actually thinking too deeply about a lot of stuff. And so the questions that they come up with are wonderful and head scratching, because as adults, you forgot to ask them. So in order to get by with daily life, you end up having to edit out a lot of information. You stop looking, you stop listening, you stop questioning, and that just enables you to hit your deadlines and get your dinner. That, I think, is the death of curiosity. You stop seeing, you stop really, really engaging with your environment. And so the antidote to that, which is encouraged to foster creativity, is walk a different way to work, have something different for breakfast, talk to somebody you've never talked to before, anything to shake your brain out of that zombie fog. And so there's something about encouraging different experiences that will waken your brain up again and make you ask different questions. An extension of that is that it's a mindset, seeking out what you don't understand. If you're confronted with something you've never experienced before, you can either go away from it or towards it. You can either try to understand it or you can write it off. And I think a curious mindset, like if you've ever sat next to somebody and they're really into something that you're not interested in, but because they love it, the more they talk about it, the more excited you get about it and you ask questions about it. And if someone's passionate about something, it rubs off, you know. So I think curiosity can be found if you're looking and you're listening. And it's vital for creativity because a key part of ideas generation is putting unexpected things together. And so the broader your experiences, the wider you cast your gaze, the more you look at the macro and the micro, the more likely you are to have just more things to draw on. If you've only got 3 puzzle pieces, you're going to make a really dull puzzle. If you've got 1,000 puzzle pieces that you can put together in different ways, you've just got more tools to play with, more ideas to have, you know. And so I think curiosity is vital for all of that.
I love that, and that sort of builds on something that the D School says a lot, and that's turning up with a beginner's mindset, and
Yeah.
and that's that idea of being a child or accepting that you're coming into the room and you're trying to leave what you know behind, because I think that the baggage that we bring into the room is also something that can be very stifling to experiencing the new. We sort of, these assumptions that we have from our knowledge, particularly as we get older and we're more educated or we have more life experiences, that those assumptions, those, I think what you're talking about, like the assumption what a cat is, but then you also bring all that pre knowledge to the room, and you're like, it can be a resistance to embracing something. So D School always says, right, beginner's mindset. So come in and sort of like, oh, I've never done this before. Even if I've never done this before, sort of like try and get that head on. And I think that's a really lovely thing. Yeah.
It's really liberating because you end up building a particular narrative about who you are and how you function. And I remember having a really lovely workshop with teachers where I put a chair in front of them and we talked about it as a functional object, and then you turn it upside down. It's no longer a functional object. And what if you put it in the middle of a gallery, what is your relationship with it? How do you talk about it? What is it? What kind of questions might you ask? It's the same thing, but the context has shifted. And what I also love is when people give themselves permission to play. There's a lot of you can't do ideas generation successfully if your ego is up or you're guarded, or if you don't trust the people who are in the room with you. I think, and so if you're wanting people to bring good ideas, you have to create a safe space where people can say really silly things and it's fine. And if you want,
and that's infectious, isn't it? That's infectious because you get that space and people create that, they build on that space. Like it's not just one person making that space, the team start to make that space, and then that becomes infectious and people start to, as you say, the ego drops, the guard drops, and the ideas start to flow. I love that.
The culture is all about best idea wins, and sort of Pixar, which a book that we both love, around sort of creativity stroke business manual, about the story of Pixar. And it can be a very challenging process. If you think your ideas, you have to be willing to put your ideas through the mincer, and the best idea comes out the other end. And that's what we're all kind of working towards. And it's to be celebrated when you do something amazing. So,
yeah. And I think the one of the experiences I've had is actually that watching the bias in the room sort of grab hold of the ideas and try and guide the ideas towards an agenda. And I think there's been some really lovely shifts away from that, where idea voting or where people anonymously vote for ideas, and then it's recognized that actually the person in the room, quite often not the designer, and some has come up with a better idea. So there's also this realization that we're all creative, we all have something to offer. And I think that's also part of that safe space that you're talking about, is that it's not necessarily predicated on your position within your organization or within your skill set. The way our brains work, sometimes the best ideas come from the most unusual places, and I think
Mm.
that's a fascinating piece in terms of creating that space and allowing that to emerge.
Mm. I I should know by now, but I keep forgetting that other people are the best resource when it comes to ideas generation. I if I get a bee in my bonnet about something and a very clear picture in my head, I sort of feel like that thought has been resolved, and it is always improved by sharing it with others and seeing what perspective they can bring, and um, it always sort of reveals where my blinkers are, stuff that had never occurred to me, and I think, and that's why this sort of interdisciplinary practice is so important, because if everybody loves the color blue and you show them the color blue, everyone's going to go, well, clearly that's the best color, and there are other colors out there and different ways of doing it. There's even different kinds of blue, and having different perspectives on something just cracks your thinking wide open. It's
And an
great.
adjacent thought, as you were saying, that was Sir Ken Robinson's talk, which I think is readily available. The RSA Animate talk that he did. Bless him. And he talks about he goes into the idea that in academia, if we sort of steal and borrow ideas or rely on others, it's plagiarism, and in life it's called collaboration. And I'm going to obviously put a caveat there that referencing and citations are important, because it is actually important to give credit where credit's due, but I think it builds up a false expectation or a false premise that collaboration in some way disadvantages us. We sort of got to hold our ideas tight to our chest and protect them, and I feel that that's almost the opposite of what we should be doing, and it's the
Mm,
opposite of what our students should be doing, in that actually, if they're in teams, even sharing their individual work with each other, finding people they can trust, who can, and building on those ideas,
yeah.
rather than thinking that everyone's going to steal my idea. It's a
Mm,
very different atmosphere to live in, a different community to live in, one where collaboration's open and free, to one where you're sort of guarding every idea. And I've said this to my students on all of my cohorts. We don't cap the marks at Exeter. There's none of the sort of moving of marks as
mm,
such. Everybody can do well, and so if you take that cohort mentality, that you can rely on your cohort and everyone can do well, you're not in competition, you're actually in collaboration. I think that sort of goes along with what we're saying, in that the people, I love that people are the best source of solving those problems, or opening those ideas up.
it's a there's some wonderful phrase. Can I remember? It's about coming from work from a place of abundance, not scarcity. And if there is something about that kind of operating with generosity, and when you're working with good people, they who challenge you, you've got to raise your game. So it will make you more creative when you're working harder, and so I think a bit of that can be, like everything, is all moderation and balance. The museum educators that I was meeting in the US, their attitude towards ideas was that they were cheap and disposable. They were worth pennies. And they'll be like, well, I can come up with 10 ideas in a meeting, and if they're all rubbish, I'll come up with 10 ideas in the next meeting. It's fine. Like, it was okay. And I think that is very freeing. And also, I suppose another way of coming at it is, if you look at someone like David Bowie, who's an absolute favorite, he did not go off and do that by himself. He did not isolate himself and just invent out of nothing. He drew on so many cultural references and so many different artists and art forms to combine to make something new. And the arts quote previous artists or different art forms. Any successful, particularly in popular culture, they draw on different art forms all the time, and to create something new. So I think there's a difference between blind copying and actually finding a gem in something and going, God, that's really exciting. What if I paired it with this? What new thing can come out of that?
And I love that, because you take that idea of generosity and abundance, so ideas are ideas are out there, they're everywhere. Once you get into that mindset, you're like, okay, I can share these ideas and something better will come from them. These ideas can be built on. So innovation, we often say innovation is cumulative rather than, it's not the sort of one eureka moment. And then the idea of synthesis, which is what you're describing, sort of like bringing those different ideas together. And actually that's, really strong in terms of being able to bring ideas together, and as you were saying earlier about your own problem solving, is that those blinkers come off, and when you share and you see a wider picture, which probably brings me neatly to I think sort of my final sort of discussion point, and that's the importance of diversity within all of this. I think something that has been really a fantastic sort of movement over the last 8 months has been Black Lives Matter, in terms of just culturally, bringing up the idea of diversity, and how do we work with diversity. In many ways, for me, it challenges the sort of deep rooted belief that we're in a meritocracy, because one injustice, when you look at one injustice, it leads to another injustice, and that connectedness becomes so obvious. But maybe not. I don't know if we need to deal with that because it is being dealt with so much, but from your point of view, the diversity in terms of, because for me it's sort of a nice point where we do widen our perspective, we do seek out others that are different from us, and I think that is so key in terms of, again, the richness of the ideas.
I mean, it is a massive topic, and I suppose where I that intersection with race that I've learned a lot from was working in museums and efforts to decolonize museums. So as a white person, you can go around looking at labels, thinking that the version of history that's being presented to you is the version that was, and there's a lack of acknowledgement, particularly when you're talking about objects outside of Western cultures that have been placed into a museum context. So you've then got all of this layers of kind of European stuff over the top of it. If violent histories are ignored, if the understanding of that object within its source community isn't acknowledged, not respected, there are so many things that need to change within the culture of how museums operate. So that is key, and I learned a lot there. When I was working with design, I was really struck. There was a conference in Edinburgh a couple of years ago about digital design, and racist bias in design was a recurring theme that came up. If you have a bunch of, well, shorthand, white blokes programming and putting in the various parameters for algorithms, that builds shocking bias into how machinery operates, or how data is collected or processed, or what results are spat out the other end. And a small, but I think really sort of striking example of this is any soap dispensers or tap dispensers where you just put your hand under the mechanism and either the water comes out or the soap comes out. And there are various videos on YouTube that these have been created without testing on dark skin, so that the mechanism does not respond to dark skin, but it will respond to pale skin. And as you know, design is not a short process. There would have been a huge amount of testing before that thing was actually manufactured and rolled out. And the lack of diversity in that chain of events that led to this product being released to the general public when it's not fit for purpose is disgraceful. And that is a tiny example, if you can imagine that multiple times over. And Invisible Women is a really interesting book on design and how it's got a male bias. So for male bodies. So one example of that is bulletproof jackets issued to the police force, and they're designed for a male frame. Well, they have been designed for a male frame, not a female one. So if a woman doesn't have a well-fitting body armor, when she's working in the police force, that's a real risk to her life. And disability is the other one. Very ableist thinking has an impact on design and what works and what doesn't. And these considerations, often there's sort of thought of as something at the end or something that's sort of political. And it's, for me, it's just absolutely fundamental social justice, and the more that you engage with it, the more you see it everywhere, and the more you sort of know how much more people need to work to understand their role in it, and what needs to change in society. So I think the Black Lives Matter has been extraordinary for sharing many opportunities for people to get more educated, like people, I think white people in particular, get more educated about perhaps some of these blinkers that folk don't even know they have.
Yeah, and I think for me that's really interesting, because I think when we're talking about good design and this, impactful entrepreneurship, that sort of idea of creating something, it seems to me that it's almost it's almost it's sort of astounding that we would leave people out, and for me we would leave even a full systems sort of view out of when we're being creative, or when we're trying to solve problems through creativity. And I think that is, it's a really, I think there is this understanding needs to be built that we do need to widen our view and also challenge. I love that idea of the chair, right at the beginning of this chat, that turning the chair upside down. It's like, well, look around. What are you not looking at is probably a really key answer. What are you editing out? Not what you're editing in. What's happening? And I think that's a really important piece. But I come back to that idea of diversity, and I go, yeah, you're going to have blind spots if you don't consider the full range of ideas and the full range of people in the room. And that might just be me being, I'm going to put this out there, I'm a loud Kiwi who loves to talk, so my ideas aren't better than the person who's quiet in the corner contemplating, and that's been proven again and again in my experience, that if you create the conditions where someone who might even they might even take time to think what their answer is going to be, but when they give their answer, it can be 10 times more profound than someone like myself who jumps in and sort of adds something, but maybe it's not that worthwhile. I'm not going to discount myself too much, but I think it's but the mix is really important, and allowing to see everyone in the room, or everyone who could possibly interact with your, in this case we're talking about products, interact with your products. It seems so important.
Yeah, there's a lot of, it's that sort of, a lot of self-awareness, I think, is part of sort of having an understanding of creativity and how it works. You need to kind of know where your strengths are, if visual working works for you, if working with others, if you need time to go away and reflect before you put your ideas back on the table, whatever it is. I think having an awareness of that, and at the same time just having that sort of just sense check moment where you're like, okay, what am I making assumptions about? Assumptions, my dad was an academic, and he had these little stickers with assumption with a sort of red line crossing it out, and they were dotted all over his office, don't assume. And so I think ask, don't assume is really good guidance when it comes to just making sure, okay, have I thought about this in the round? Ask, put it out there. It will be improved by feedback.
Yeah, I like that, because we have something called an assumption board in entrepreneurship, where we need to know our assumptions, right? We need to know what assumptions are and what we're definite about, and so I like that, and that does lead to what should we be experimenting on, where should we be testing, and I think that brings us nicely, Sarah, all the way back to curiosity, because curiosity allows us to go and have that conversation with somebody who's different from us, or to look at something that we wouldn't normally look at. That is curiosity. That is, what's behind that door, or what does that person think, that, and then listening to maybe somebody who's very different from us, and sitting there and taking in what they're saying is curiosity for me. And I think that's a really lovely full circle.
Very tidy.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to hearing the response from this podcast, and I look forward to finding out where this journey takes us.
Lovely. Thank you for the invitation. It's good fun.
Thank you. Music provided by bensound.com.